The doctrine of discovery is the current system of laws and policies that justify the removal of land from Indigenous peoples. These laws are rooted in church doctrines that originated in the 15th century.
Together, we will uncover this deep structure of colonization that systematically deprives Indigenous peoples of human rights.
I'm Sherry Hostetler, and I hope to start a coalition of Anabaptist people of faith that seek to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. I'm also a Mennonite pastor in San Francisco.
And I'm Sarah Augustine, and I also helped start this coalition. As an activist and scholar, I'm the descendant of the Tewa people and a displaced person. This is the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery podcast. Oh, well, it's my great privilege and joy to introduce Debbie Royals, the Reverend Canon Debbie Royals, who is an elder to me, somebody to whom I'm accountable, and also a dear friend. Debbie, it's been so wonderful to get to know you over the last several years as we've been working together in the process of trying to dream what liberation is for our people and then trying to embody that. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in a few minutes, but I want to introduce you first by saying, Debbie Royals is a faith leader, a powerful Indigenous woman, and a prophet, somebody who is speaking to the institutional church, calling that institutional church to kinship with Indigenous people and to repair. Welcome, Debbie. So glad to have you here.
Choki Otesia, Sarah. Leo Sanchiani Avu Ketchimalea. I am Debbie Royals. I am Pascua Yaqui on my mom's side. I grew up here in Tucson, Arizona, long before we were a federally recognized tribe. We didn't become federally recognized until 1978. And I always like to tell people that I was Yaqui before Yaqui was cool. On my dad's side, I'm Eastern Cherokee, was not really raised in that tradition, so I don't really practice any of the culture and spiritual practices, although we have many traditions in our family that clearly have been interwoven into it from the Eastern Cherokee people. I am serving as a pilot chaplain for the coalition to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. And I came here very much because it was the next place on the path that was placed in front of me, I think, from a spiritual perspective. We journey through our lives and encounter, as we said, issues about how and what we are and who we are as people. My life as a Pascua Yaqui woman is one that lives a life of resistance to the Episcopal Church, even as an Episcopal priest. And I believe that even in that resistance, I am actually doing exactly what the church needs me to be doing. I came to the coalition because of the work that we were doing here in the Diocese of Arizona and speaking truth to power, particularly as it applies to the doctrine of discovery, as it applies to our recognition of the 22 federally recognized tribes in Arizona, and then also getting into the Arizona history of boarding schools and acknowledging that Arizona is the state with the second largest number of boarding schools in the U.S. And so our work has been intense, and I was blessed to, after many years of hearing Sarah Augustine's name and studying her book and talking about her as if I knew her, to actually have the privilege of being able to say I actually have touched physically her presence and bonded with her spirit and ceremony. So I am so honored and blessed. Sherry, you have been a huge blessing also in this new venture that we're looking at as a pilot chaplain for the coalition and what that means and where that's going to lead us. It is liberating, I have to say, because it is not structured.
That's so true. Oh boy, you got that right. Well, Debbie, I want to just delve a little bit more into your role in the Episcopal Church. I know you just came upon your 20th anniversary of your ordination, and I'm excited to honor you for that milestone when we see each other. And you know, I just you've been so inspirational to me in my life because of the way that you have made for the people that are coming after you in the ministry in the Episcopal Church. The way that you have made has not been easy, and I think it took a while to get ordained. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, actually, it's very funny when we talk about my ordination, and especially now just having celebrated the 20th anniversary.
Mhm.
I was in the ordination process for 10 years
Right.
before I
Wow.
was ordained. And most of the reason for that is because as a Native woman, I refused to be assimilated.
Mm,
Even as much pressure as I was receiving
mm,
from the church as a whole, the structure of the church, locally, the priest who was mentoring me, and our tribal chairman, who all saw me as a spiritual leader, couldn't understand why it was so difficult to find
mm,
a way to recognize my role that was already present in the Pascua Yaqui community in Old
mm,
Pascua, where I grew up, where my grandmother was a healer, where my family has roots. But it took them 10 years, and ultimately, when I did go to seminary, although I was very resistant about going to seminary. I have to say that put me in a very difficult position because culturally it was a culture shock for me to leave Tucson, where I'd lived my entire life, to go to a place that was very unfamiliar and socially, culturally, traditionally very different. And honestly, Sarah, I have to own the fact that I still talk about this, and I talked about it at my ordination ceremony anniversary. Um, at the end of my first semester of seminary, I was leading a Native congregation up in Northern California. But I was miserable, and I was making everybody around me miserable. And
mm.
I will forever be grateful to Jenny Tepa, who's Maori, who was my mentor during seminary, who said to me one day, either go or stay.
Mm,
And it was in the moment, shocked me, right? But it also made me realize that the journey is not going to be easy.
right.
And it never was promised to be easy.
Mm,
And if that's what I was expecting, then I was in the wrong place.
mm,
But if I was going to stay, then I had to take it with everything that it came with. And that's when I say to people, I have lived a life of resistance my entire life, and now I have to resist the church itself that functions as a representation of our relationship, our corporate relationship with God, and
mm,
how so frequently that corporate relationship with God challenges me because it is so narrow and
mm,
unwilling to live in the spirit.
mm. So I want to just acknowledge once again how that work of resistance has really made way for younger people. I mean, I don't mean younger chronologically necessarily, but people who are coming up, especially Indigenous leaders in the church who are coming forward now, that you've actually paved a pathway. And not to say that it's easy now, but I think it is easier, Debbie, because of the work that you've done to make that way, as a trailblazer. And I also want to just acknowledge the importance of the role that you've had in my life and really deepening and expanding my understanding of ceremony and ceremonial life. One of the things that you said to me, Debbie, in one of our times together was, we practice these ceremonial ways as a discipline, not just because it's a good thing to do or because it's an enjoyable thing to do, but by making it a discipline, we are shaping ourselves. It's an accountability that we are
Yeah.
shaping in our relationship with the spirit of life. And that's been really crucial for me because, as I am doing my practices, some of which you have affirmed for me and others I've learned with other elders, is I'm engaging those things on a daily basis. Your voice often rings in my mind when I'm busy, or I think, oh, I have other things to do. And I think, no, Debbie's, this is reinforcing what we're about on a spiritual plane. It's not just, going through emotion, or it's not just, something that I choose to do when I feel like it. This is a responsibility, and I appreciate that, and I'm so grateful, so grateful that you have chosen to join us in the coalition as our pilot chaplain. That is, when I say pilot chaplain, by that, what I mean is the person that is once again making way within the coalition, blazing a pathway for how we are going to hold spirituality and even pastoral care, how we care for the folks that are among us as we engage in this very difficult work of, resisting authorities and also imagining and creating alternative systems. And so, so grateful to you, Debbie. And I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about what this being a pilot chaplain is all about.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I also want to say, because of what you brought up, that just to go back with paving the way, our elders have taught us for years and years that nothing that we do belongs to us, and that everything we say, every way that we act, everything that we think about, all of that affects everybody who follows us. So when we talk about paving the way and beginning in a pilot position, for instance, it really does go back to what I said about the kind of shock of hearing somebody say either stay or go. And then if you're going to stay, then how do you stay and remain whole? How do you remain intact? How do you maintain your integrity and your authenticity? And I went back completely into daily life is set up by our Creator in a rhythm, in a pattern that we are invited into to follow. And our participation in creation means that we wake up in the morning and recognize that we have woken up and are in the morning time. And what does that mean to us? How the middle of the day approaches us, how the end of the day, when we recognize that the light is fading and the dark is beginning to take over. How do we inventory ourselves at the end of the day, not to punish, which oftentimes came out of so much of the missionization of people, that whole concept that's not even a concept in our native ways. Um, how do we then, inventory ourselves to know what it is that we are really grateful and thankful for, and what do we intend for the next day? How do we then prepare ourselves? So, this pilot position with the coalition is really just, in my mind, coming in to a space where space has already been provided for us to be intentional about everything that we say, how we act, what we think about, and to do that in a covenant with each other,
Mhm.
to determine the change in and well to determine and to change the way that the world functions, because the functioning of our world that we're currently in is really functioning according to contracts where there's, binding agreements. You do this and I'll do
Mm,
that. If you do
mm,
this for me, I'll do that. There's reciprocation, whereas covenant agreements are all in. You are 100% liberating everything about yourself, surrendering your whole self into what you are doing. And that's what I believe this pilot chaplain position really represents. It's
Hmm.
a liberation of all of what everybody is doing and bringing together our thoughts in a covenant relationship
mm,
to share with everybody who the coalition touches.
mm.
Wow. Debbie, I'm deeply moved by how you've described that. And I know that when I was on, I was one of the people that interviewed you for the position, and I just felt like 5 minutes in, I just felt this almost like settling down into myself and eh, in this way of like, this is the person who's bringing the vision and the spirit and what we need for this pilot chaplain position. And I think just the what you've just said right now is uh, very indicative of why you were absolutely the right person to be in this position.
Mm.
Oh,
um,
thank you, Sherry.
yeah, and I know you had a pretty strong sense of call to this
Mm.
position. I believe you talked about being a bridge. Is that, am I using the right image?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. As I said, I think that it was placed in front of me as
Mm.
the next step from a spiritual perspective, that it became very clear to me in ceremony that I was being moved in a direction and that direction included the coalition, that this work that I had been doing elsewhere, being the person that I have been, needed to be in this new environment again um, because I was being called to covenant with a group of people
Mm,
who were like-minded in our journey together.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as part of that bridge that you're bridging, in terms of, the
Mm.
coalition is largely, although certainly not exclusively, white settler folks who are coming alongside Indigenous folks in their struggle for self-determination, and also in terms of like water and land protection. One of the main things that you have done during the first 6 months is lead the decolonized, or I think we sometimes call it decolonizing worship that we do every month. I actually like the fact that I think we do call it decolonizing worship because it is a work in progress. We can't,
That's right.
we can't just say we're doing decolonized worship. We're feeling our way into what decolonizing worship is. And you and I have had quite a few conversations about that. But I'm wondering if, so in order to talk though about what is decolonized or decolonizing worship, we need to talk about what is colonized worship or colonizing worship. And, when you and I talked previously, as we were getting ready for this podcast, I told you that one of the things as a Mennonite pastor that I do when I teach our new members classes is we go back in the history of the church and basically say that here's the church that Jesus and then the disciples right after him were establishing. And we look at, I think it's Acts 2, where it's mostly house churches. It's house churches where people are sharing with each other and worshiping in the house together. And then you get to sometime I used to actually know the date, I think it's 320 AD. And Christianity becomes when Constantine has his supposed conversion during a battle, um, he that Christianity becomes allied with the empire, with the Roman Empire. It becomes basically the state church or the of the empire. And one of the things I teach in my new members class is like almost immediately you start getting costly buildings being built, like these huge, cathedrals, and there's these very ornate vestments, and the clergy now become a privileged class, and it becomes fashionable to be a Christian. And there's actually becomes more of a focus on correct doctrine and elaborate rituals instead of discipleship, or following Jesus in everyday life. Nothing against rituals, I really love rituals, but you know what I'm talking about here. So that is what we don't call that colonized worship, although I think we almost could, because almost from the get-go, Christianity was colonized by empire. So
Yeah.
what do you, when you think of decolonized, or I'm sorry, colonized or colonizing worship, how do you think about that?
Well, it is so interesting to think about this from a historical perspective, right? And especially when we think about scripture, and beginning with scripture in the Old Testament, and knowing that the Old Testament stories are continually reminding us that this is an indigenous group of people's reflection of their relationship with God.
Yeah.
Beginning with the New Testament and the coming of Jesus into the story at that point in time. Jesus even is pointing out time after time after time about how they have begun to get so married to the law that they've forgotten the spirit. And he continues to bring them back into thinking about the spirit. So, how is the spirit calling you to be as a person who recognizes your creator, and who the creator has brought us all good things, and our mother earth that has sustained us, and the resources that were available to us, and how are they equally shared, and that there is no ownership, but that is, again, covenant relationships with people, and how those house churches, were they to continue on, even in, as you said, in Acts and the stories beyond there, their description almost starts to begin to, you see that certain ones of the home churches or house church gatherings, as varied and diverse as they had to have been, because if I go to your house, it's going to be a different system than when you come to my house, and when I go to Sarah's house, we're all going to be different. But there seemed to be that movement of, okay, we've got to get this together, everybody needs to be doing the same thing, we need to move the same way, we need to act the same way, we need to talk about the same things. So just recalling the experiences of the spirit present in the reminder that Jesus gave us, that the Spirit was what he was here to remind us, not of the law. We still, systemically, of course, we know it, systems are very difficult to break because they're so strong that as soon as there's a lack or a lapse in leadership, the system defaults back to its previous self, right? To the needing to have everything defined. So I think it's really important for us to see that structure as that is a structure. How many years old that we are talking about decolonizing?
Yeah.
This is not something that's going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
Um, and as one of my elders and one of my dear little brother, Steve Darden, says, we're not here for the end result. That's not we don't need to busy ourselves with the end result, that everything is so goal oriented. I want to see, what did I accomplish here? How am I able to say, look what I've done? But instead, that we just continue to work towards that same movement and have faith, because we're in covenant relationships, that everybody who follows us, as long as the movement continues, is going to continue that path. Maybe a little bit variations here and there, but that's the way that the world works, right? Because the earth herself is changing around us. So we have to move alongside of creation, with it, in unity with it, not against it, or kind of coming into some kind of conflict with it.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things that we were thinking about, or I was thinking about, Sherry, when we first started talking about um, trying to hold space for decolonizing worship, was how worship spaces, as they are conventionally, are are uncomfortable for Indigenous people to be in, and for many people who have been marginalized. That the way we would do worship at all is painful, and I think that's not necessarily obvious to folks who are in the dominant culture. It feels like this is just tradition. This is the way we've always done it. And I think part of the things that are uncomfortable are the reassertion of dominance, hierarchy, the empire itself. All of those things are harmful and painful. The canon, the biblical canon, is diverse and beautiful, and the pieces that are brought out, even in the liturgical calendar, tend to be those pieces that are reinforcing of authority and empire. And so as we were thinking about decolonized worship, it's kind of like, okay, what else is there, And as for me, this is just my personal experience. As I started thinking about what else is there, it just became really obvious to me that what we focus on is what's very narrow, which is what you were saying before, Debbie, that what else there is huge.
Yeah, it is
What
huge.
we've been doing is so narrow, And I think, we talk about this also in terms of visuals, like even worship space can feel really colonized in terms of the images that we have, the kinds of ideas that we're replicating, in our worship space, also in the way that we carry out that worship. So often it is to reinforce authority, and so
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, it's so funny that I have to tell you that one of my most challenging experiences as an Episcopal priest is how often I have heard from most congregations, almost every congregation I think I've ever been with. There's a criticism if the worship service goes over an hour, or if the sermon or the message goes over 10 minutes, right? And then I have to laugh, and of course you're going to remember this, Sarah, because the very first decolonized worship service that I led for the coalition ended in 45 minutes. And somebody made a comment and said, well, it usually goes for about an hour. And I tell you, I had such a laugh that day because I thought to myself, oh, yeah, the work is in front of us here. We've already adapted that sort of, as you said, in our traditional ways, and of course in my sassy response to congregations, I've often pointed out and said to them, oh gosh, I didn't actually realize that we put a time limit on how much we invest in our relationship with God. That God's only allowed an hour of our time because there's so many more things that are important than God, you know. Um, so, I try and say that in a sort of sassy way, not to, really be angry with people, but for them to hear how ridiculous it is that, our ceremonies begin and end when they begin and end.
Yeah, so true.
Um, and when things need to be said, or when we feel something that comes up during that time, we honor that, and you talked about space and how we address that space, the many ways in which some places, stand and sit and kneel and stand and sit and kneel for different things. And some of those are so contradictory to my own experience. Like, if you're going to pray, you get as close to the ground as you possibly can. You don't stand up, get as far away from the ground as you can. There's so many places where we could go into this conversation of
Yeah.
how many ways that colonized worship has evolved over time.
This podcast is hosted by us, co-produced by the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery and Anabaptist World.
The opinions expressed here are ours, however, and do not reflect official positions of Anabaptist World.
For more information, go to anabaptistworld.org and dismantlediscovery.org.
Our theme music is by Micah Peplow and Shannon Kaler. Thank you.